I thought our love was unbreakable until one fateful night in Silent Valley when my husband vanished without a trace. Alone in the stillness, I was left to grapple with the haunting silence and the questions that swirled in the void he left behind. Let me know where you're tuning in from, and hit like if you believe that sometimes, the deepest wounds come from those we trust the most. The first light of dawn filtered weakly through the dense canopy of Silent Valley, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floorboards of the small cabin. I woke abruptly, the cold pressing against my skin, and immediately noticed the absence beside me. Daniel was gone. The bed's warmth, so familiar just hours before, now felt like a hollow echo of what had been. Panic prickled at the edges of my mind as I sat up, my heart hammering in my chest. There was no note, no whispered goodbye, nothing to explain why he had left in the night without a word. I swallowed hard, my throat dry and tight. The silence wasn't comforting, it was suffocating. Outside, the valley held its breath, the stillness so profound it felt like the world itself had paused, waiting for me to make sense of his sudden disappearance. The cabin, once a refuge we had chosen together, now felt like a cage. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to stave off the cold and the overwhelming sense of betrayal. How could he just vanish like this, leaving me alone in a place so far from everything we knew? I stood slowly, the floor creaking beneath my feet as I moved toward the window. The early morning mist clung to the trees, and the faint sound of a distant stream was the only sign of life. I pressed my palm against the glass, wishing for a clue, a sign that this was some cruel mistake. But the world outside was indifferent, as silent and unyielding as Daniel's absence. The cabin was small but cozy, filled with remnants of us, half-unpacked bags, a stack of books on the shelf, his favorite mug still sitting on the counter. I felt foolish standing there, searching for meaning in objects that now felt meaningless. My fingers brushed over the worn leather cover of a journal he had been keeping, but I hesitated before opening it. What if the answers there were worse than the void he left behind? Instead, I moved to the other side of the room and began to explore more thoroughly, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. I needed to understand why he had left, needed to find something that anchored him here, or something that explained why he had chosen to leave me behind. The cabin was silent except for the soft scrape of my shoes against the floor. It was then that I noticed a faint outline beneath the rug near the fireplace. Kneeling down, I pulled the heavy fabric back and discovered a small, weathered box tucked beneath the floorboards. It was hidden carefully, as if meant to remain undiscovered. My breath caught in my throat. Daniel must have placed it here, but why? And why hadn't he told me? With trembling hands, I lifted the lid. Inside, there were letters, yellowed and fragile with age, photographs that seemed to capture moments I had never seen, and a few trinkets wrapped in faded cloth. Each item felt like a piece of a puzzle I hadn't even known existed. The letters were addressed to no one, or maybe to someone who no longer existed. The photographs showed a younger Daniel, smiling with people I didn't recognize, places that were unfamiliar but clearly held meaning. I sat back on my heels, overwhelmed by the weight of what I had found. It was as though I was seeing a side of him that had been hidden beneath layers of silence and half-truths. The man I thought I knew was slipping away with every new discovery, replaced by someone I barely recognized. The tears I had been holding back spilled over, blurring the edges of the photographs in my hands. I felt a strange mix of sorrow and anger. How could he carry all this alone? Why hadn't he trusted me enough to share it? The box was a secret he had buried beneath the floor, just as he had buried the truth from me. I knew then that leaving wasn't just about him escaping something, it was about cutting ties, erasing the life we had built together. The silence was deliberate, a final act of abandonment that left me stranded in a valley that felt both beautiful and unforgiving. Determined not to let his disappearance define me, I carefully packed the box's contents into my bag. I needed to understand, to unravel the story he had hidden. The valley, with all its quiet mystery, was no longer just a backdrop to my heartbreak, it was the place where I would have to face the unknown, piece by piece. The sun climbed higher, and the cabin grew warmer, but the chill inside me remained. I stepped outside, the fresh air sharp against my skin, and looked out over the valley that stretched endlessly beyond the trees. I felt small, alone, but also strangely resolute. Daniel's absence was a wound, but it was also a challenge. I whispered to myself, a vow made in the stillness, I would find out why he left. I would uncover the secrets he thought he could bury. And I would survive this silence, no matter how deep it ran. With the box in my hands and the weight of uncertainty pressing down, I took my first steps into the day, into the valley, into the unknown life that lay ahead. I spent the first night alone in the cabin with the box nestled beside me like a silent, heavy witness to everything I didn't yet understand. The letters lay spread out on the rough wooden table, their fragile edges curling under my trembling fingers. I hesitated before unfolding the first one, the ink faded but still legible, and as I began to read, a door creaked open into a past Daniel had kept locked away. His words were raw, filled with fears and regrets I had never seen in his eyes. The letters spoke of debts he had accrued, debts that weren't just financial but emotional, tangled in promises he couldn't keep and mistakes he couldn't undo. He wrote of a life lived under pressure, of secrets buried beneath layers of silence. Each sentence chipped away at the man I thought I knew, revealing a stranger shaped by unseen battles. Tears blurred the ink as I read on, but beneath the sorrow, a strange determination took root. I couldn't turn away from this. If Daniel had been carrying this burden alone, then maybe it was time I understood it too. Maybe, in knowing his past, I could find the reason for his sudden disappearance, and perhaps, find a way to face the future he'd left behind. The photographs were next, a gallery of moments frozen in time. There was Daniel as a boy, standing shyly beside a man I guessed was his father, their faces etched with an unspoken tension. Another showed him laughing with a group of friends, yet his eyes held a shadow I couldn't ignore. Each image was a puzzle piece, fragments of a story I had never been part of but now had to piece together. I decided I couldn't leave Silent Valley just yet. There was too much I didn't know, too many questions that needed answers. The valley felt less like a prison and more like a place of reckoning, where I could confront the ghosts Daniel had left behind. I resolved to stay, to unravel the tangled threads of his past, no matter how painful the journey might be. The next morning, I ventured into the nearby village, the box tucked carefully in my backpack. The locals were wary at first, their eyes flickering with a mix of suspicion and sympathy when I mentioned Daniel's name. It was clear he hadn't been an easy man to know, carrying burdens that weighed heavily on those around him. But slowly, as I spoke to more people, I began to gather pieces of his story. Mrs. Harper, the owner of the small general store, remembered him as a quiet boy who had left the valley years ago, chasing dreams that never quite came true. She spoke of debts Daniel had tried to repay, and of a man haunted by choices that had cost him dearly. Her words were gentle but tinged with sadness, as if she too mourned the loss of someone who had once been part of the community. A farmer named Tom shared stories of Daniel's struggles with his family, hinting at a fractured relationship that might explain his flight. He was a good man, but life dealt him some hard blows, Tom said, eyes distant. Sometimes, running away seems like the only option when the weight gets too much. Each conversation added layers to the picture I was painting, complex, painful, and deeply human. Daniel's past was no longer a mystery, it was a tapestry of love, loss, and fear. And as I listened, I felt my resolve harden. I wasn't just uncovering his secrets, I was reclaiming my own agency in a story that had tried to leave me behind. But the deeper I went, the more I realized that this journey wasn't mine alone. The valley held its breath again the day Daniel returned, his figure emerging from the mist with a weariness that mirrored my own. He looked older, thinner, his eyes shadowed by regret and something like hope. He wanted to explain, to justify why he had left, why he had abandoned everything and everyone he claimed to love. I met him on the edge of the village, the box still clutched in my hands. His voice was quiet but insistent as he told me about the debts, the fears, the decisions that had driven him to silence. He begged for understanding, for a chance to reclaim what he had lost. But I was no longer the woman who waited for answers in the dark. I had built new foundations in his absence, found strength in the valley's silence. I stood firm, looking into the eyes of the man who had once been my husband, and I refused to be pulled back into the shadows of his past. I needed to know who you really were, I said, voice steady. And now I do. But you can't expect me to just forget everything and pretend like nothing happened. His face faltered, the arrogance replaced by a raw vulnerability I hadn't seen before. He nodded slowly, perhaps understanding that this was no longer just his story, it was ours, and I was determined to write my own part. That night, as the valley darkened and the wind whispered through the trees, I sat by the fire with the box open once more. The letters, the photographs, the pieces of Daniel's hidden life, they no longer felt like chains but keys. Keys to understanding, to healing, and to the possibility of a future rebuilt on truth. I knew the path ahead would be difficult, filled with moments of pain and revelation. But I also knew that staying here, in Silent Valley, was my choice. To face the silence, to uncover the past, and to find my own strength within it. And as the flames danced and the night deepened, I whispered a promise to myself, I would not be defined by his secrets or his absence. I would find my way through the shadows, one truth at a time. The days stretched on in Silent Valley, each one folding into the next like pages in a book I was only beginning to read. I found myself drawn deeper into the lives of those who had known Daniel before our paths crossed, people whose memories painted a picture far more complicated than the man I once loved. Some were cautious, their eyes wary when I asked questions, as if reopening old wounds threatened to stir ghosts better left to rest. Others were kinder, their voices soft with sympathy as they shared stories of a man struggling beneath the weight of burdens he had never fully revealed. One afternoon, I sat across from Clara, a woman who had been Daniel's childhood friend. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed me a faded photograph, her eyes fixed on a spot beyond the cabin's window. He was always running, she said quietly. Not just from people, but from himself. There were things he never told anyone, things that made him afraid to stay anywhere for too long. Her voice cracked, and I realized she had carried this pain for years, much like I was now carrying it for the first time. Clara's words echoed in my mind as I walked back to the cabin, the photograph tucked safely in my pocket. I clutched the box of letters and keepsakes tighter, feeling the invisible threads that connected me to Daniel's past grow stronger. The valley no longer felt like a place of isolation, it was a crossroads where I could confront the truth and begin to understand the man who had vanished without a word. But understanding came with its own set of challenges. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the sky bled shades of orange and purple, Daniel reappeared at the edge of the village. The sight of him sent a jolt through me, a mixture of anger, confusion, and a lingering hope I hadn't dared to acknowledge. He looked worn, the lines on his face deeper, his eyes shadowed by regret. He approached cautiously, his voice tentative as he broke the silence between us. I didn't want to leave like that, he said, his gaze searching mine. There were things I thought I had to protect you from, things I couldn't face. But I was wrong. His words hung heavy in the air, filled with the weight of unspoken apologies. I met him where the forest met the village, the box of secrets still by my side. You left without a word, I replied firmly, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. You abandoned everything we had. I needed to know who you really were, and now I do. But that doesn't mean I can just erase the pain you caused. He nodded slowly, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through the defenses he had built. I'm sorry, he whispered. I want to make things right, if you'll let me. But I was no longer the woman who had waited silently for answers. I had found strength in the valley's quiet embrace, in the stories of those who had known him before me. I had uncovered truths that reshaped my understanding, and I wasn't willing to be swept back into the shadows of his past. I'm not sure what right means anymore, I said, my eyes steady. I have to figure out who I am without you. And that means standing my ground. For a moment, he looked lost, as if the man he thought he was had slipped through his fingers. Then, with a heavy sigh, he stepped back, the weight of his absence settling between us like a chasm. The days that followed were filled with an uneasy balance. Daniel remained in the valley, trying to reconnect with the people he had left behind, while I continued to piece together the fragments of his life that had been hidden from me. Our interactions were cautious, marked by a shared history that neither of us could ignore but neither was willing to fully embrace. One afternoon, I met with Mr. Jenkins, an elderly man who had been a mentor to Daniel in his youth. Sitting on the porch of his weathered farmhouse, he spoke with a gentleness that belied the toughness of his words. "Your husband was a good man, but he carried a darkness that few could understand," he said. "He made mistakes, yes, but running away was never the answer. You have to decide what you want from this, for yourself and for him." His words lingered as I walked back through the trees, the sun filtering through the leaves like shards of hope. I realized that this journey wasn't about forgiving Daniel or forgetting the past, it was about reclaiming my own story. The valley had taught me that silence could be broken, that pain could be transformed into strength. That night, as the fire crackled in the hearth and the wind whispered through the cabin's cracks, I sat with the box open before me. The letters, the photographs, the memories, they were no longer just evidence of betrayal but pieces of a story that I was learning to own. Daniel's return had stirred the valley, but it hadn't shaken the foundation I was building. I whispered into the dark, a quiet promise to myself: I would face the silence, confront the shadows, and stand firm in the truth I had uncovered. The man who had left was not the man I would follow. This was my journey now, and I was ready to walk it on my own terms. The morning air in Silent Valley was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and earth, and for the first time since Daniel's disappearance, I felt a flicker of hope stirring within me. The cabin, once a reminder of abandonment and unanswered questions, was beginning to feel like something more, a place where I could carve out a new life on my own terms. I had made the decision to stay, not out of resignation but out of a growing sense of empowerment. This valley, with all its silence and secrets, was becoming the ground where I would rebuild myself. I started with the cabin itself, clearing the clutter left behind in the rush of Daniel's departure. Each box unpacked, each corner cleaned, was a small act of reclaiming the space that had once felt foreign and cold. I painted the walls a warm cream, hung curtains that caught the morning light just right, and arranged the furniture to suit my needs rather than his. The process was slow and sometimes exhausting, but with every brushstroke and every sweep of the broom, I felt the weight of the past lift just a little. The box of letters and photographs remained close, not as chains but as reminders of the journey I was on, a journey of healing and discovery. I read through Daniel's old words again, but now with a different perspective. I no longer saw them as secrets meant to hurt me but as pieces of a story that had shaped him and, by extension, the life we had shared. I was learning to hold the pain without letting it define me. With this newfound strength, I began reaching out to the community that had once felt so distant. I attended local gatherings, shared meals with neighbors, and slowly built the connections I had lost. Some were surprised to see me still here, others welcomed me with open arms, but all helped me feel less like an outsider. Their support was a balm to the wounds left by Daniel's absence, and I realized that I wasn't alone in this valley after all. One afternoon, I met with a local attorney named Sarah, recommended by Mrs. Harper. The conversation was daunting but necessary. Sarah listened carefully as I explained my situation, the abandonment, the hidden debts, the fractured relationship with Daniel, and assured me there were ways to protect what was mine, legally and emotionally. Together, we began the process to secure the cabin and the surrounding land, steps toward reclaiming my future that felt both terrifying and liberating. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself growing more confident, more certain that I was capable of creating a life beyond the shadows Daniel had cast. I started volunteering at the village library, a place of quiet comfort where stories lived and breathed, and where I felt a kinship with the narratives of resilience and renewal. It was there that I met Emma, a teacher who encouraged me to consider applying for a position at the local school. The idea of teaching, of shaping young minds, sparked something inside me, a purpose that had been dulled by years of uncertainty. The cabin became a sanctuary not just for me but for the possibility of new beginnings. I planted flowers along the porch, their bright colors a stark contrast to the muted tones of the valley's trees. Each bloom was a small victory, a symbol of growth and hope in a place that had once seemed so unforgiving. I imagined restoring the old beach house my grandparents had left behind, a legacy Daniel had tried to steal but couldn't take from me. With every step, I reclaimed not just the land but my identity. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned a soft pink, Daniel appeared again at the edge of the property. This time, there was no anger or desperation in his eyes, just a quiet acknowledgement of the distance that had grown between us. I met him on the porch, steady and calm. "I see you're making this place your own," he said softly. I nodded, the strength I had gathered shining through. "I'm not the same woman who waited for you in silence. I'm building my life here, with or without you." He looked away, the weight of his choices settling around him like a shadow. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know that I'm sorry." "I hear you," I said. "But I'm focused on moving forward now. This valley, this cabin, they're mine to shape." As he turned and walked away, I felt a profound sense of closure, not because the past was erased, but because I had claimed my future. The valley no longer held me captive, it had become the ground where I stood tall. That night, I sat by the fire, the warmth spreading through the cabin and into my bones. I thought of the women I had met who had faced their own struggles, the support groups where stories like mine were shared and honored. I knew I wasn't alone and that together, we could find strength in our shared experiences. I whispered a promise to myself, a vow forged in the quiet determination that had carried me this far. I would keep building, keep healing, and keep reclaiming my life. The shadows of the past would no longer define me. This was my story now, and I was ready to write it anew, one step at a time. The morning sun spilled golden light across Silent Valley, bathing the cabin and the wildflowers I'd planted in a soft, hopeful glow. The air was alive with the hum of bees and the distant call of birds, a symphony of life that felt like a celebration of everything I had fought to reclaim. Standing on the worn wooden porch, I breathed deeply, letting the crisp air fill my lungs, feeling more grounded than I ever had before. This valley, once a place of silence and shadows, had become my sanctuary. I had learned to embrace its quiet beauty, to see the wildness not as isolation but as freedom. Each day, I tended the land around the cabin, clearing brush, planting seeds, coaxing life from the stubborn earth. The work was hard, but it was mine. With every weed pulled and every flower that bloomed, I felt myself growing stronger, more connected to the place I now called home. In the village, I had found a community that welcomed me not as a stranger but as one of their own. I shared meals with neighbors who had become friends, laughed at stories told around campfires, and lent a hand when needed. The support I found there was a balm to the wounds left by Daniel's betrayal, knitting together the pieces of my heart with threads of belonging. Teaching at the local school had become a source of joy and purpose. Standing in front of a classroom filled with curious faces, I felt a renewed sense of identity, a woman not defined by loss but by resilience. I shared stories of strength and hope, encouraging my students to find their own voices, just as I had found mine. Each lesson was a step forward, a building block in the life I was creating from the ruins of the past. The beach house my grandparents had left behind, once a symbol of what I thought I'd lost forever, was now a project filled with promise. I had spent weeks planning its restoration, reaching out to contractors and gathering materials, determined to bring it back to life. It wasn't just about the house itself but about reclaiming the memories and legacy it represented, a testament to family, love, and endurance. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, I stood at the edge of the valley, watching the light fade. The vastness before me was humbling, a reminder of how far I had come and how much lay ahead. The silence that once felt oppressive now felt peaceful, filled with possibility. I thought about the journey, the abandonment that had shattered me, the secrets I had uncovered, the strength I had forged in the valley's quiet embrace. Each step had been a struggle, but also a victory. I understood now that being left alone had forced me to find a part of myself I never knew existed, a resilience that no one could take away. As the first stars appeared, I whispered a promise into the cool night air, a vow to honor the woman I had become. No longer defined by Daniel's choices or the pain he left behind, I was free to write my own story. A story of healing, hope, and new beginnings. The wind carried my words across the valley, weaving them into the fabric of the land I had come to love. And in that moment, surrounded by the beauty of Silent Valley, I knew I had already won the most important battle, reclaiming my life and my future. If you loved the story, like the video and subscribe.